Welcome to Bharati 100, a podcast dedicated to exploring the life and work of Indian national poet C. Subramania Bharati, exactly 100 years after his death. This is Mira T. Sundararajan, Bharati's great-granddaughter. Several weeks ago, I had the opportunity to speak to filmmaker Michael Wood about C. Subramania Bharati. In this episode, I'd like to present the next segment of our conversation, which delves into some very delicate and difficult material. Michael has a deep fascination with languages and literature, as is obvious from much of his work as a filmmaker. And one of the things that he noticed in the collection of Bharati's English writings that has just been published is that Bharati, on several occasions, deals with Tamil. And in particular, he writes about the status of the Tamil language in imperial India. He writes about the efforts made by the British administration to phase out Tamil as a language of education for Tamilians. And Bharati is deeply disturbed by these efforts. He feels very strongly that the British simply don't understand what the Tamil language is. And he outlines the case for placing Tamil on a par with the European languages that were familiar to the British, and with English, of course, looking back at Tamil's distinguished history as a literary language and at the refinement of terms arising in the Tamil language to deal with so many aspects of human life and thought. The British had made an argument, perhaps not that surprising, that Tamil and other so-called vernacular languages of India, and this is a term that Bharati absolutely hates. He says there's no way we should be talking about a language as ancient and distinguished as Tamil, as a vernacular language. This is a literary language. This is a classical language coming into the modern era. But the argument is made by the British that Tamil is simply not suitable for the modern world, that it's not suitable for talking about science and technology, that it can't really respond to the needs of modernity. For Bharati, this is a completely inappropriate, incorrect perspective, and he argues forcefully in the brief words that he writes that actually Tamil is very well suited for modernity, as it has been for every aspect of human life in the thousands-long history of Tamil culture, and that we must recognize the stature of the language by looking at exactly that, at the history of the language and at the quality of the literary productions that that language has called forth, has inspired. Now, it may be tempting to say that, notwithstanding Bharati's comments and the very moving defense of the Tamil language that he makes, his arguments are perhaps outdated because we've moved past that era. In a sense, that battle has been lost because today we live in an era where English is so dominant. It has become a global lingua franca, and it's very difficult to maintain the importance of national languages like Tamil in the modern context. Knowledge of English is essential. It's simply required to carry on with modern life and to be successful in the modern environment. Well, there's no denying the importance of English or the ubiquity of English today, and yet to say that Bharati's arguments are outdated would, I think, be simply wrong. Because actually, the problem that he talks about is one that is with us, in a sense, today, even more strongly than it was in his time. Because what we're seeing in the modern era accompanying the global success of English is a decline in languages all over the world. And in fact, in some cases, it's a catastrophic decline where languages are considered to be seriously endangered, that is to say, in danger of disappearing. And this is something that has been identified as a problem by the United Nations. Why is it a problem? Well, looking at the world that we live in, we're living at a time of crisis, and the crises that we're confronting, like the climate challenge, are global crises. And what we're finding, I think, is that there is a real shortage of ideas and initiatives to take us forward into a more creative future, to help us to grapple with these immense challenges in a creative and ultimately successful way. And part of the difficulty that we're facing, this impoverishment at the level of ideas, can, I think, be linked with the issue of linguistic impoverishment too, because languages represent cultures. They represent ways of thinking and different perspectives. And just at the time when we need enrichment in this sense, when we need to have a diversity of ideas and approaches and creative thinking available, this is the time when we're seeing a decline in that human diversity around the world. So Bharati's ideas in this regard, far from being outdated, I think are more relevant than they've ever been in the past. Except that now we're talking about a challenge facing languages on a much grander scale than it existed at Bharati's time. And the problem of impoverishment of human ideas is something that is becoming a serious detriment to the progress of human life. I think that Bharati's own attitude towards languages is so instructive in this regard. I mean, he wrote in Tamil, and he had such a facility for the Tamil language, for his mother tongue, right from the time of his earliest childhood. He received the title of Bharati as a 7-year-old child, so he was already writing fluently poetry at that age in the Tamil language. So he had every facility in his mother tongue and no real need to learn any other language. And yet, was that his approach? Absolutely not. On the contrary, he took every opportunity that crossed him in his lifetime to become familiar with other languages and indeed to acquire fluency. When I say fluency in the context of Bharati, I mean literary capabilities, a degree of comfort with the literature and the literary traditions of the different languages that he came into contact with. And there were so many of them because he traveled all over India. He learned Hindi, he learned Bengali. He studied in Benares for a period of time and became deeply familiar with Sanskrit and later on engaged in a deep study of Sanskrit literature with his friend Sri Aurobindo Ghosh. So for him, learning languages was part of his education, and it was something that he thought of as an important activity. It's one in which he invested a good part of his short life, of the efforts that he made towards intellectual achievements during his short life. Looking at the Book of English Writings, it seems clear that Bharati had a strong interest in exploring languages as a writer. And in fact, the variety of languages that he learned probably allowed him to explore the richness of his own mind in ways that he could not have done writing in a single language, even one so richly endowed with vocabulary and literary history as Tamil. There's arguably something very important to be learned from his example in this regard as in others, especially for those of us like myself who come from one linguistic tradition but end up growing up and spending our lives in another or in others. I myself have lived in both English and French-speaking areas of Canada and of the world. And the lesson here, I think, is that we have another resource available to us, one that we may not always be highly conscious of, and that is our mother tongue, which is to say the language of our mother. And of course, Tamil people, they often use the expression Tamil Thai, Mother Tamil, to refer to the language. And I think those words signify better than anything else I could say the immense attachment and the depth of respect and reverence that every Tamilian feels right down to their bones for their language, or, as in my case, the language of my mother. Here's a resource available to us, here's an opportunity, and here is an important part of the wealth that our cultural traditions have bequeathed to us. It's our language. In today's world, that passion, that interest, that desire to learn and to learn about mother tongues, our own or others, is an important part of what can help to take us forward, to take our world forward in a positive direction. I was thinking about these issues in another very moving context just a few days ago when I came across a story on the Canadian news, on CBC News Online, about a young girl who comes from an Indigenous Canadian community, and her name is Adeline Sophie Newman Ting. And this girl, who is a mere 11 years old, has written and published a book, and the book is called Finding the Languages. And it's a story relating to characters who are searching for words in Adeline Sophie Newman Ting's native language, which is the Kwakwala language of the Indigenous people of her part of Canada on the West Coast. Adeline is quoted at the end of the article, and I would just like to read her words to take us into the conversation with Michael Wood. She says, "It's not a good thing to try to make everybody the same, and we shouldn't try to banish what makes everybody different and special. We should try to celebrate it, celebrate different languages and different people who speak different languages." Thank you, Adeline.
Reading the book, it seems to me that Bharati's case for Tamil is one of those really, really true perceptions. You know, when he talks about the Tamil epics of the Roman period, Silapadikaram and things like that, when he talks about the Kural, when he talks about the version of the Ramayana done in Tamil Nadu in Cholan times, and he is not contemptuous, because he's never contemptuous, he's a very generous spirit, but he holds Europeans to account when they talk demeaningly about vernacular languages.
Yes.
And he says, are there things as good as this in the European tradition? You know, so he is setting out to place material from the Indian tradition and the South Indian tradition in the light of a world consciousness, if you like.
Yes, I think that's so beautifully put, actually. And I think that's exactly right. In that particular essay, that question that he asks is such an important one. You know, he says, here are our masterpieces. What have you got? Let's see what you've got. Let's see how they actually measure up against one another. And I think it's one of the tragedies, and hopefully not one beyond correction, but it's one of the tragedies of the course of history, at least to the present time, that reckoning hasn't really taken place, I don't think. We are in a place where we can at least make statements, you know, and say, well, okay, there is the Tamil tradition and these wonderful epics are there and they're very ancient and there's a continuity, something you've so beautifully highlighted in your programs on India. The continuity of the culture beginning back in that day and continuing up to the present is something quite unique in the world, I think. So we're at that place where we can say, well, this is here. But what I fear we don't really have, or don't have as much of as we should, is the ability to read and engage with those literary works directly. Mm-hmm. And to do so as easily as we can with the works of Shakespeare and Molière and Goethe and Schiller and so on. And what the solution is for that, I don't know. I think, you know, the most that I can say is that we need to have somehow better scholarship and more availability of materials for people who want to both learn the language and learn about the language. more engagement in translation and so on. So this is kind of a process that we'll probably have to work through backwards now, sort of going from where we are and finding our way back to the mother language, Tamil.
Yeah, it's a difficult situation, isn't it? Because and Bharati was obviously well aware of the pervasive nature of English, the English language and literature, its ubiquity. There was no kind of going back on that. And that was and that presents you with a very difficult question, doesn't it, as to how in a culture like Tamil, which is still very heavily, and certainly in his day was a memorizing culture, how it holds its own against such a powerful opposite tradition, if you like. And the essays are partly about that, aren't they? I mean, if in a sense, obviously, study of the Tamil language and literature is a lifetime's job. These are difficult things to master, and very few people in the West who are not of Tamil or South Indian origin can master them. And that battle between English and Tamil, which he so cleverly highlights and passionately highlights, is, people could see the writing on the wall in his day, couldn't they? The great scholar U.V. Swaminathaya, in his wonderful autobiography, The Story of My Life, he refused to learn English. I mean, he actually took the side of the Tamil language and published those epics that were rediscovered in the 1860s and 70s, published them in Tamil only. But it's a very difficult task in a global culture where English is so dominant.
Well, you raised so many interesting points there. I mean, consider that Bharati was writing before 1921, and we were already in a situation of global dominance of the English language. That in itself, to me, is something fascinating, because, of course, we talk about that now today as if it's something new that's happening in a way, but clearly it isn't. It's been happening for at least the past 100 years. And I think there is some optimism to be gained from looking at the past 100 years, trying to look at that side, which is that the Tamil language is still very much there. And it is spoken by many people around the world, and perhaps more importantly, that these literary works continue to be read. And of course, Bharati himself, as you said in your introduction, has become such a well-known poet among Tamils. I don't think that any Tamil with even a minimal amount of education would be able to quote at least some small lines of Bharati's poetry, even key words. I recently was contacted by someone who wants to make a T-shirt with the words "Achamillai," I have no fear, printed on the T-shirt, saying that here's a very simple way to improve the world. And it's hard to argue with that, actually. But just to say, that the language is still alive and well at a certain level. Yeah. But in terms of the more pessimistic side, the which also must be reckoned with, the issues that he raised haven't really been dealt with. And it's interesting that you give the example of the great Swaminathan. So Bharati's approach was not to reject English. On the contrary, he got an English education, and he educated himself in English by reading, and he fell in love with the Romantic poets, in particular, the English Romantic poets, and adopted Shelley Dasan, the follower, the slave of Shelley. That's literally what Dasan means. I who bow and salute Shelley, the great poet. That was his pen name, Shelley Dasan, at one point in his life.
That's great.
So I think that as a poet, he could never, in a sense, he could never feel anything but love towards the English language, because it is a great vehicle for poetry.
Yes.
But at the same time, it was not to be had at the expense of any other language, and more particularly his own Tamil. So it's a very paradoxical situation, because I think you're absolutely right that there is a bit of a struggle for domination between the languages that has taken place, and which English, I think, has decisively won. That struggle seems to me, at least, to be over. But on the other hand, the solution for that probably involves a greater quality and quantity of dialogue between the two languages, as I was saying before. Now we need to find our way back. And I think that Bharati would very much feel that the Tamil language is definitely the heritage of the Tamil people, no question about that. But he would also see it as part of the world heritage of language, literature, and poetry. And so he would be encouraging people to learn and to become learned in Tamil. And to your remark that it's very difficult to learn Tamil, he would say, I think, of course it is, but there are solutions. Let us make more texts available. Let us have more scholarship. Let us dedicate more resources and make it a success.
And we can't prejudge how things will go in the next 100 years, can we? It may well be that the English language literature's dominance, the role of English texts in the curriculum will change, and that great Indian texts, which have been undervalued in the past, will grow in prominence. In one sense, historically, we're in an early stage of Indian independence, and there are big battles still to be fought. And given that the Tamil and the South Indian peoples in the South have a very strong feeling that they don't want to be dominated by Hindi, there's a great role for Tamil and for the sustenance and continuance of Tamil, I think.